The history and the genealogy of this particular story is rather convoluted because I started thinking about this many years ago, before I even wrote my first novel. I was taking another history class as a PhD student, and it was about archives and women. And when women surface in the archive, it's usually because they've done something wrong or have been in the wrong place. And this is mostly women of Black women, because I was doing Southern Africa, Black women and colored women, women who are not supposed to be in the city in general. And I found this fascinating, how women's movement sometimes translated to them being read as mentally ill. And I wanted to tell that story. But then I started writing The Theory of Flight, so sort of like that story took a back seat. But I always wanted to tell that story because I found it very interesting, and I spent a lot of time in archives myself, and it is very difficult to find the stories of Black women and colored women, and even women who are sort of like pushing against the status quo. And it's fascinating, interesting for me that most times a woman comes up in the archive, it's because she has literally done something wrong. She's been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or she's challenged an authority figure. That's the only time her name will be mentioned. So there are all these women living in the city, but they're never mentioned. They've become sort of like invisible. So I'm very interested in making those invisibilities more known and pronounced, and sort of like exposing what the life of colonized Black or brown woman was like back then. So that was sort of like the impetus for this story. And again, it took a long time because between that idea and the actual creation of this novel, the creation of Half-Broken People, I've written 3 other novels. So it was always there, and I knew it was a story that I wanted to tell with a lot of care and a lot of delicacy because it deals with a lot of difficult issues. But I wanted to do it justice. And I hope I have, but it did take a while to write it, yeah. Writers, I think, are always trying to say something about the human condition, and we're always trying to get people to empathize with characters, because I personally feel that's how people learn about themselves, is through reading and understanding how humans behave and interact. So I think that overall overarching impetus for writing is always going to be there. I think it's also important as a writer who is African and lives in Africa to show the diversity of African stories, and diversity in terms of the characters, but also the experiences that they go through. I think sometimes the story of Africa is very singularly told, or told through a very narrow lens. And I think we're living through a moment right now where I think African writers are expanding what the idea of an African novel and African story can and cannot be, or is. And so I think I'm part of that, and I'm very much aware that I'm part of that. And it's important for me, thematically, to raise a lot of things that I think people don't necessarily think about when they think about Africa. To think about issues sort of like from the global south that are very prevalent all over the world, but looking at them from this particular vantage point and seeing how they can also sort of like elucidate certain things that maybe people don't really consider when they're thinking about things like race and racism in the 21st century. When you think about it from another vantage point, maybe it will open up another way of thinking. I think a great example of that is the way Southern Africa has delineated its race structure in a way that the rest of the world doesn't quite understand, but it's sort of like maybe we can learn something from the way this happened here in terms of how to learn from it and then move forward in certain ways. I believe there's a lot that Africa itself can teach the world, and that's why I write.